the story about Japanese Unit 731, these guys were from a death factory. And as they put it, they had purely scientific goals to better understand the capabilities of the human body.
Without regard for humanity, they sought to understand how the body reacts to cold, pressure, various diseases, blood loss. Gruesome times.
But not for him, Shiro Ishii. He was, let's just say, a peculiar figure. And since 1926, he advocated for the creation of a biological weapons program in Japan. In 1928, he traveled through Europe, studying the use of poisonous gases during World War I, but he was quickly expelled.
But most importantly, the Japanese authorities quickly became interested in him.
Thanks to this, he quickly found high-ranking patrons, and the Minister of War became his main supporter and force.
The doctor quickly climbed the career ladder and in 1936 was appointed as the head of the newly formed Unit 731.
There he arrived with the rank of major, and within a few years of the war, he rose to the rank of lieutenant general. His titles and awards were received for the killing of a huge number of prisoners of war and civilian populations. According to the highest estimates, around 500,000 people were killed. The main complex of the unit was not in Japan, but in Manchuria, a part of China that the Japanese captured during the war. This was deliberately done as it was easier to bring prisoners here. By the way, this was not Japan's first attempt to create a biological laboratory. Shiro in 1932 led the so-called Toga unit, which already resembled the future death factory. They brought prisoners there, fed them well, and measured all health indicators. And as soon as the doctors concluded that the patient was completely healthy, they killed him in the most elaborate ways. For example, slowly draining all the blood and observing when death occurred, or starving them, or infecting them with deadly diseases.
But it had to be closed, because one of the prisoners escaped, and he knew the location of the laboratories and could tell about the atrocities happening there. Therefore, the Japanese
quickly closed everything down, burned it, shot those who remained, and moved. Shiro learned from past mistakes. So, the main complex of Unit 731 was built like a fortress over all the years of its existence. No one could escape from there. Prisoners were not given names. Each was assigned a 3-digit number upon entry and locked in solitary chambers, chained. Even during the war, Japanese scientists from the unit calmly published the results of their research in international scientific journals, detailing all stages of the experiments. However, it was claimed that they were not conducted on humans, but on Manchurian monkeys. And of course, Shiro Ishii was far from the only doctor involved in the torture. About 300 scientists from all over Japan participated, and practically none of them ever showed any signs of pity. I'll talk about the experiments themselves a little later, but for now, I'll say that not all of them had specific goals. Often Japanese doctors did things just to see what would come out of it, so to speak, out of professional curiosity. For example, to see how the body behaves if the head is severed, or what happens if the stomach is removed and the esophagus is attached directly to the intestines. Prisoners were not considered. Kill one today, and tomorrow they'll bring another. So there was no need to spare people, even from pragmatic considerations.
In some cases, they introduced bacteria of plague, typhus, and other diseases for study.
Prisoners were forcibly made to engage in sexual activities to observe how these diseases were transmitted. And to see if diseases were transmitted to a child from infected women, they were forcibly impregnated. But to understand how the disease behaves inside the human body, you need to somehow look inside the body. They simply cut open a living person from chest to pelvis. But they didn't limit themselves to just diseases. They amputated various limbs to study blood loss, removed parts of lungs, liver, and even the brain to see what would happen to the body. By the way, dissecting living people was not only enjoyed by Unit 731. More than 1,000 military doctors around the world engaged in this. But that's not all. They also used human targets for testing weapons, such as grenades and flamethrowers. People were brought to the range, dressed in different clothing, and explosions were set off at various distances from them to calculate the optimal distance for killing. And in what ways were tested on humans, ranging from artillery shells with shrapnel to bayonets and knives. Those who didn't die immediately were tried to be treated, not out of humane reasons, but only to understand which wounds could be cured and which could not.
It started like a movie. One prisoner pretended to be sick, and when the guard entered the chamber, he attacked him and took the keys.
He opened all the doors he could find, released dozens of people, but the labyrinth of corridors proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. In the end, guards simply shot all the rioters. And here's another interesting fact. Essentially, the Japanese didn't care whom they killed in the name of science. There was a doctor named Ishii Sudo, and he wasn't lucky. During one of the experiments, he contracted the plague. You'd think they would put him in a special box and start treating him intensively. But no, Dr. Sudo became just another test subject. He gradually lost weight, developed purple spots, and struggled to breathe more each day. In the end, like the others, he was tied to a surgical table. His intestines were removed, and apparently Sudo didn't understand until the very end what was happening. According to eyewitness accounts, his last words were a scream, "Beast!" as he yelled at the one who approached him with a scalpel.
But Unit 71 became notorious not only for such experiments.
The main task of the unit was to create biological weapons to fight on the front lines against the active army.
And you know, it's much easier to create an epidemic behind enemy lines and capture already evacuated cities.
But biological weapons, like any other, require testing, especially since attempts to use the weapons without trials ended in failure. In 1939, during battles between the Japanese and the Red Army near Khalkhin Gol, a group of scientists under the leadership of the same Shiro Ishii decided to infect Soviet soldiers with typhoid. For this, they poured several barrels of poisoned water into the river flowing towards the Soviet positions. But something went wrong, and no one got sick.
So, before trying this again, it was decided to first test the new weapon on local residents.
Planes simply started dropping plague bombs directly on cities. The first targets were Ningbo and Chando. In 1940, as a result of the plague, tens of thousands of people died there.
But that wasn't all. In Nanjing, the Japanese infected wells with typhoid.
Where locals drew water, a few days later, an epidemic broke out in the city. Researchers enthusiastically wrote that typhoid was the most effective disease.
Still, there was a war, and when the territory where the main complex of Unit 71 was located ended,
the Japanese had to hastily abandon the equipment, and from above, the order came to erase all traces. The documents were destroyed. The remaining 300 prisoners were even shot, and 600 camp workers were also executed. The complex building was blown up, and each chief and doctor were issued capsules with poison so that they wouldn't reveal secret information if captured. But despite such secrecy, we still found out what was happening in the unit.
next we must say to Colonel Sanders.
He arrived in Japan immediately after the war to investigate the Japanese biological weapons program. Naturally, he knew nothing about Unit 731, but he found an argument that worked flawlessly on the Japanese. He threatened the scientists that if they refused to cooperate, they would be handed over to the Soviet Union. The threat worked, and the next day, Sanders received a handwritten confession, which he personally delivered to General MacArthur. Thus, Americans learned for the first time about the horrors the Japanese were involved in. McCarthyism gave immunity to the entire camp leadership. Why? To prevent other countries, especially the USSR, from finding out about it. In addition, in Japan, he faced a military tribunal, but none of the camp leadership stood before the court. Only the prosecutor once mentioned experiments with poisons. Shiro Ishii lived to old age, even traveled to the USA to give lectures, and in Japan, he opened a clinic where he treated people for free.